Imagine lying awake at night. The world outside is silent, but inside your chest feels heavy. A thought creeps in: what if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if tomorrow doesn't go the way I planned? We've all felt it, the silent shadow that follows us through life. Fear. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper, a tightening in the stomach, a hesitation before making a choice. Other times it roars, paralyzing us, convincing us that we are smaller than we really are. In today's world, fear wears many masks. For some, it's the fear of rejection, of not being enough in a society that demands constant proof of success. For others, it's the fear of loss of love, health, money, or security. And beneath it all, often hidden from daily awareness, is the most universal fear of all: the fear of death, the fear of the unknown. We spend so much of our lives trying to push fear away, pretending it doesn't exist. We drown it out with noise, scrolling endlessly through social media, working ourselves to exhaustion, chasing distractions that never truly satisfy. Yet when the lights go out and the world grows quiet, fear returns, as if waiting patiently in the corners of our mind. But what if fear isn't the enemy? What if fear is not something to be silenced or destroyed, but something to be understood? The Buddha once described fear as a flame that burns only when there is fuel to feed it. That fuel is ignorance, clinging, and illusion. When we don't see clearly, when we hold on too tightly, fear grows stronger. But when understanding enters the mind, the flame begins to fade. Think about it. The first time you faced a challenge that terrified you, maybe speaking in front of a crowd or moving to a new city, you were filled with fear. But once you stepped into it, once you understood the experience for yourself, the fear dissolved. It didn't disappear by force. It dissolved through insight. The truth is, fear is a universal teacher. Every one of us, no matter where we come from, carries it. It shadows our decisions, our relationships, our dreams. And yet, hidden within that shadow is the possibility of freedom. In this journey we're about to take together, we won't be running from fear. We won't be covering it up or pretending to be fearless. Instead, we will walk directly into it, gently, with curiosity, with compassion. Because only when we see fear clearly, only when we understand its true nature, does it lose its power over us. This isn't just a lesson for monks in monasteries or mystics on mountaintops. This is about daily life, about the quiet anxieties that keep you awake at night, the hesitation that stops you from speaking your truth, the doubt that makes you shrink when life calls you to grow. Fear has shaped human history. It has driven wars, built empires, and fueled innovation. It can both protect us and imprison us, but beneath all its faces lies one simple truth: fear is not permanent. It is not who we are. And the key to dissolving it is not resistance, but understanding. So, as we begin this exploration together, I invite you to pause for a moment. Feel your breath. Notice the way your body responds to even the word fear. Is it tension in your chest, a racing of thoughts, a heaviness in the gut? That sensation is the shadow we all carry. And it is here, in this very moment, that the path of transformation begins. Because fear dissolves only with understanding. And once we learn to see clearly, what once felt like a shadow may just become a doorway to freedom. Fear, it feels so familiar yet so mysterious. We think we know what it is because we've felt it so many times. But have we ever stopped to truly look at it, to understand what this shadow actually is? At its core, fear is a survival response. Long before skyscrapers and smartphones, our ancestors walked through forests filled with predators. The rustle of leaves might signal danger. The quickening heartbeat, the flood of adrenaline, the sharpened senses, all of this was the body's way of saying, stay alert, protect yourself, live another day. Fear, in that sense, was a gift. It kept humanity alive. But here's the paradox. In the modern world, most of our fears are no longer about lions in the tall grass. They are about things we cannot see or touch. Fear of failure, fear of loneliness, fear of being judged, fear of not having control over the future. These fears may not threaten our physical survival, but they grip our hearts just as tightly as if they did. Science tells us that fear originates in the amygdala, a small almond-shaped part of the brain that reacts in an instant before rational thought can catch up. That's why fear feels so overwhelming. It bypasses logic and strikes directly into our body. Our palms sweat, our breath shortens, our muscles tighten. We are thrown into fight, flight, or freeze before we even know what's happening. But if we look deeper, beyond biology, we find something even more profound. In Buddhist teaching, fear is not just a chemical reaction. It is a mental formation born of ignorance. It arises when the mind grasps at something as permanent, when it clings to illusions, when it believes it can control what is by nature uncontrollable. Take the fear of death, for example. The body trembles at the thought of its own end. But what is death if not the natural continuation of change? We fear it because we imagine ourselves as fixed, solid beings. Yet when we see life as impermanent, when we recognize that birth and death are part of the same flowing river, fear begins to soften. Or consider the fear of rejection. Why does it hurt so deeply when someone doesn't accept us? Because we cling to the idea of self, to the belief that our worth depends on others' approval. When that illusion cracks, fear rushes in. But if we see clearly that the self we defend so fiercely is not fixed but fluid, ever-changing, then the rejection loses its sharpness. So what is fear really? It is a mirror. It reflects back to us the places where we are still holding on, still resisting reality. Fear is the spotlight that shows us where ignorance hides. And here lies the key. Fear is not wrong. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a natural response, both biological and spiritual. But when we misunderstand it, when we let it dominate our lives without seeing its true nature, that's when fear becomes a prison. Imagine standing in front of a locked door. The lock is fear. Most people spend their lives banging on the door, trying to break it open or turning away in defeat. But understanding, true, deep understanding, is the key that unlocks the door without struggle. To see fear clearly is to transform our relationship with it. Instead of an enemy, it becomes a messenger. Instead of something to run from, it becomes something to learn from. So the question is no longer, how do I get rid of fear? But rather, what is fear trying to show me? And once we begin to ask that question, the shadow starts to look different. It no longer feels like a wall standing in our way, but more like a guide pointing us toward the truths we've been avoiding. If fear is a shadow, then its roots run deep, tangled into the soil of the mind. To understand fear, we must follow these roots, tracing them back to where they begin. In Buddhist teaching, there are three primary roots that give rise to fear: ignorance, attachment, and the desire for control. Let's begin with ignorance. Not ignorance in the sense of being uneducated or uninformed, but the deeper, subtler ignorance, the inability to see things as they truly are. We perceive the world through the lens of illusion, clinging to permanence in a world that is constantly changing. We identify with our thoughts, our emotions, our bodies, as if they are fixed and unchanging. And when we imagine that what we hold dear might vanish, fear arises naturally. Picture a person terrified of losing their job. The fear is not just about missing a paycheck. It is about the illusion that their identity, their worth, their very life depends on that security. When the mind clings to this belief, fear flourishes, growing bigger and darker than it would otherwise. Next comes attachment. Attachment is the thread that binds us to the world, to people, to outcomes. We grasp at what we love, desperately trying to hold on. And the tighter we grasp, the more we fear losing. The child clinging to a parent, the lover clinging to another, the professional clinging to success. Each is caught in the delicate web of attachment. Attachment creates a paradox. It brings pleasure, but it also brings fear. Every moment of joy carries the shadow of loss. Every bond we cherish whispers the possibility of heartbreak. And yet, Buddhism does not demand that we renounce all connection or all love. Rather, it invites us to see clearly that clinging is optional, and freedom comes from learning to love without entanglement. The third root is the desire for control. We crave certainty in an uncertain world. We want life to unfold according to our plans, our expectations. We want to hold the storm at bay to map every step of the journey. And when the uncontrollable inevitably arrives, illness, betrayal, failure, fear rises like a tidal wave. Control is an illusion. Life is fluid, unpredictable, ever-changing. The more we attempt to dominate it, the more resistance we meet, and the stronger fear becomes. But here is a profound truth. When we release the illusion of control, when we meet uncertainty with acceptance, fear loses its grip. Consider a simple image, a leaf drifting on a river. It does not fight the current. It does not demand the water change course. It moves with the flow, feeling every ripple and swirl, yet never clinging. In the same way, when we see the roots of our fear, ignorance, attachment, and control, we can begin to loosen our grip and let life flow without being overwhelmed by it. Each of these roots, ignorance, attachment, control, feeds fear silently, often without our awareness, but recognizing them is the first step toward liberation. It is like turning on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, the shapes we imagined lurking in the shadows are revealed for what they truly are. And as we illuminate these roots, we discover something remarkable. Fear is not permanent. It is not an inescapable part of life. Its power lies in our misunderstanding, in our clinging, in our resistance. When we begin to see clearly, when we meet life with insight rather than illusion, fear begins to lose its hold. The journey does not end here, of course. Understanding the roots of fear is only the beginning. To dissolve it, we must learn to engage with fear directly, to observe it, to meet it with curiosity rather than avoidance. This is where true transformation begins, the point where shadow becomes guide and fear becomes teacher. And in the next steps, we will explore why so many of us try to escape fear, and why that escape is always an illusion, leading us to the doorway where understanding can finally take root. We all try to run from fear. It's human nature. From the moment we recognize its presence, we instinctively look for ways to escape it. But the truth is, fear cannot be outrun. No matter how fast we move, no matter how clever our distractions, fear follows us quietly, patiently, like a shadow refusing to detach. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you tried to avoid something that made your heart race? Maybe it was a difficult conversation, a looming deadline, or the possibility of change. Maybe it was a fear that someone would reject you, or that you would fail at something that matters deeply. And what did you do? Perhaps you buried yourself in work, scrolled endlessly on your phone, or filled your schedule with noise and busyness. Anything to avoid facing that uncomfortable tremor inside. But avoidance is an illusion. It gives the temporary relief of control, the fleeting comfort of distraction, but it never addresses the root. The moment the distraction fades, the fear returns, sometimes stronger, more insistent, more urgent. In Buddhist terms, running from fear is like trying to outrun your own shadow at sunset. The more you run, the longer and darker it stretches behind you. The more you resist it, the more it shapes your life. Escape may feel like a solution, but it is often a trap. Modern life has perfected the art of avoidance. Endless entertainment, constant notifications, social media feeds that demand attention. These are all ways we try to anesthetize ourselves from the uncomfortable stirrings of fear. We consume, we scroll, we distract. But beneath it all, fear waits, quietly observing, ready to rise when the noise fades. The Buddhist path offers a radically different approach. Instead of escape, it suggests engagement. Instead of resistance, it teaches observation. Instead of trying to silence fear, it asks us to look directly at it, to see it for what it really is. Imagine standing in a room filled with smoke. Most people would run, hold their breath, or cover their faces. But what if you simply opened a window, observed the smoke, and let it rise and disperse naturally? In that moment, you are no longer struggling against it. You are no longer fueling it with panic or resistance. You are simply aware, and the smoke begins to dissipate on its own. Fear works the same way. When we stop running, when we stop feeding it with avoidance, it starts to lose its power. It reveals itself for what it truly is, a transient, conditioned experience, not an enemy, not a permanent state. There is a profound freedom in this realization. It does not mean fear disappears instantly. It does not mean that life becomes risk-free or painless, but it means that fear no longer controls you. You no longer live under its shadow. Instead, fear becomes a signal, a guide, a teacher showing you where your mind is still clinging, still resisting, still entangled in illusion. Every time we confront fear instead of fleeing from it, we train the mind. Every time we notice the trembling, the racing heart, the tightening chest, and allow ourselves to observe without judgment, we practice freedom. We learn that the mind can hold fear without being consumed by it, that the heart can feel the tremor and still beat steadily. And so, the illusion of escape begins to fade. We begin to see that the only way out is not through running, not through avoidance, not through distractions. The only way out is through understanding, through insight, mindfulness, and the gentle courage to look clearly at what has always been present within us. As we begin to recognize this, the stage is set for a deeper transformation. Now that we see the futility of fleeing, we can turn our attention to the very heart of fear, to the place where it is born, and learn how understanding can dissolve it entirely. If the illusion of escape is finally seen for what it is, the next step begins: understanding. True understanding is not intellectual. It is not about knowing the word fear or reading countless explanations. It is about seeing clearly, feeling deeply, and meeting fear with a heart that does not shrink away. Think back to the last time you were truly afraid. Perhaps it was a moment when your whole body tensed, your mind raced, and every instinct told you to run. Most of us respond by trying to push the feeling away, by telling ourselves, this isn't real or I shouldn't feel this way. But here is the key. The more we resist, the stronger fear becomes. Resistance is fuel. Understanding, on the other hand, is the gentle art of looking directly at fear without judgment, without fleeing. It is observing it as it arises, noticing its texture, its color, the way it pulses through the body. And in that observation, something remarkable happens. Fear begins to soften. Buddhism calls this insight vipassana, the ability to see things as they truly are. Fear is recognized as impermanent, just a ripple on the surface of consciousness. It is seen as conditioned, arising from causes and conditions that can be understood. And it is understood as not self, not an inherent part of who we are, but a passing state of mind. Imagine a stormy sky. The clouds gather, dark and threatening. Lightning flashes, and thunder shakes the earth. Most of us run for cover, terrified of what might come. But the wise observer looks up, sees the storm for what it is, a natural temporary phenomenon, and watches it pass. Understanding does not remove the storm instantly. The rain still falls, the winds still blow, but the panic, the terror, the sense of being overwhelmed begins to dissolve. This is how fear dissolves, not by force, not by distraction, not by suppression, but by understanding. And here is the subtle miracle. The deeper the understanding, the more fear transforms into wisdom. That trembling that once seemed unbearable becomes a teacher, pointing out where the mind clings, where the heart resists, where the ego still struggles to maintain control. Consider the fear of failure. When approached with understanding, it is no longer a crushing weight. Instead, it becomes a guide, showing us what we value, what we hold tightly, what we are afraid to lose. By seeing clearly, we begin to act with courage. Not from the absence of fear, but from a place of insight. Even the deepest fear, the fear of death, can be transformed. When we understand impermanence, when we truly see that all things arise and pass, the fear of the end begins to soften. We may still feel sadness or apprehension, but it no longer dominates our mind. It becomes a gentle reminder of the preciousness of life, a call to live fully and wisely. Understanding requires patience. It requires us to sit with fear, to breathe with it, to name it and face it, moment after moment. It is not a quick fix, but a practice, a lifelong cultivation. Yet each step we take in understanding, each moment we meet fear without resistance, is a step toward freedom. And freedom in this sense is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of clarity, the ability to feel fear fully and yet not be enslaved by it. It is the recognition that fear is a teacher, and understanding is the doorway to transformation. When we cultivate this awareness in our daily lives, the ordinary moments of anxiety, the tightness in the chest before a meeting, the worry over a relationship, the hesitation before a difficult choice, begin to lose their power. We learn to move through life with steadiness, grace, and compassion, no longer trapped in the shadow of fear. Understanding dissolves fear because it meets the root of the problem, ignorance. Where there is clarity, illusion cannot hold. Where there is insight, resistance falls away. Where there is presence, fear becomes not a prison but a doorway, a passage into wisdom, courage, and the freedom to live fully. And from this doorway, the mind naturally turns toward mindfulness, toward observing each moment with calm attention, ready to meet fear not with panic but with gentle curiosity. Once we begin to understand fear, the natural next step is to meet it, to face it with openness, attention, and presence. This is the heart of mindfulness, the ability to observe our inner world with clarity, without judgment, without fleeing, without resisting. Fear often appears suddenly, uninvited, like a storm cloud on a sunny day. The heart races, the breath quickens, and the mind spins stories of doom. Most of us instinctively want to escape, to distract ourselves, or to push it away. But mindfulness invites a different approach. Instead of fleeing, we pause. Instead of resisting, we observe. Picture this, a panic attack rising like a wave in the chest. Instead of telling yourself, I must get rid of this, you take a breath and notice the sensation. You feel the tightness in the shoulders, the fluttering in the stomach, the quickening of the pulse. You name it silently. This is fear. This is a passing state. This too is impermanent. In that moment, fear is no longer a tyrant. It becomes a guest, something to be observed, not fought. You notice the thoughts that fuel it, the images that the mind conjures, the stories it tells about the past or the future. And in observing, the grip of fear begins to loosen. Buddhism teaches that all phenomena are impermanent, including fear. By bringing mindful awareness to the experience, we see it arising, lasting briefly, and passing away. Fear is not a fixed entity. It is a flow, a wave on the ocean of consciousness. When we meet it mindfully, we ride the wave rather than being swept under by it. Let me share a story. A meditation practitioner once described feeling a deep anxiety about losing her job. Her chest ached, her thoughts spun uncontrollably. She could have tried to ignore it, drown it in distractions, or panic. But instead, she sat quietly, focusing on her breath. She noticed the fear in her body, traced its origin in her thoughts, and watched it rise and fall like clouds across the sky. Slowly, she realized that the fear was not permanent. It was a message, pointing to where she was clinging and resisting. By meeting it directly, she felt a sense of liberation she had never known before. Mindfulness does not remove fear instantly, and it does not always feel comfortable. Sitting with fear can be challenging. It can reveal layers of vulnerability, insecurity, and pain. Yet in facing these layers, we cultivate resilience. We learn that the mind can hold fear without being controlled by it, and that the heart can feel trembling and still remain steady. This practice transforms fear from a source of suffering into a teacher. Each moment of mindful attention is a step toward freedom. Each pause, each breath, each gentle observation loosens the grip of fear and illuminates its true nature. Mindfulness also allows us to respond rather than react. When fear arises in daily life, before a conversation, a decision, or a challenging encounter, we can notice it, breathe, and choose a response rooted in awareness rather than panic. The tightness in the chest no longer dictates our actions. The racing thoughts no longer command our decisions. Instead, we act from a space of clarity, compassion, and wisdom. And this is the beauty of the practice. Fear is not something to be eliminated. It is not an enemy to be defeated. It is a companion on the path, a guide pointing us toward deeper understanding, greater presence, and the freedom to live fully. By meeting fear through mindfulness, we begin to see that it has never been outside of us. It is a reflection of our relationship with life, with uncertainty, with change. And as we observe, breathe, and stay present, the shadow that once haunted us becomes a mirror, revealing not only our vulnerabilities but also our capacity for courage, insight, and profound peace. Once we begin to meet fear mindfully, something extraordinary starts to happen. Fear stops being just an obstacle. It begins to teach. Most of us see fear as a problem, something to avoid, something to conquer. But fear has another role. It is a teacher, a guide pointing to the parts of our mind and heart that remain hidden in shadow. Every tremor of fear, every racing heartbeat, every anxious thought is a signal, telling us where we are still clinging, still resisting, still caught in illusion. Think of the stories we tell ourselves. Fear whispers, "This is dangerous. This is too much. You cannot survive." But underneath the whisper lies a lesson. Here is where you are attached. Here is where you resist life. Here is where insight is waiting. The Buddha, as the story goes, faced fear in its most intense form under the Bodhi tree. Mara, the embodiment of fear and desire, tried to shake him from awakening. Mara conjured armies, temptations, and threats. Yet the Buddha did not flee. He did not resist in panic. He faced the fear with unwavering awareness, seeing it clearly for what it was. And in doing so, fear became the very teacher that guided him to enlightenment. In our own lives, fear operates in the same way, though on a smaller, quieter scale. The fear of speaking up in a meeting, of asking for help, of making a life-changing decision. These are subtle forms of Mara, inviting us to examine our attachments and illusions. When we meet them courageously, they teach us resilience, honesty, and clarity. Consider a parent watching a child leave home for the first time. The fear is intense, a knot in the stomach, a racing mind. But beneath it lies a profound lesson about love and letting go. The fear teaches patience, trust, and the understanding that control is never complete. Or imagine an artist facing the blank canvas, trembling at the thought of failure. The fear can be paralyzing, yet it also teaches attention, diligence, and the courage to create despite uncertainty. Without fear, we might never confront our limitations, never grow, never discover the strength within ourselves. The teacher in fear is subtle. It does not shout, it does not lecture. It simply shows us the corners of our mind we prefer to ignore. It points to our clinging, our attachments, our illusions of control. And if we choose to listen, to learn rather than resist, fear guides us toward wisdom. This is why Buddhist practice often frames fear not as an enemy but as a mirror. The trembling in the chest, the racing thoughts, the tightness in the stomach, these are reflections, showing us where our understanding is incomplete, where insight is still needed. By observing and learning from these reflections, we cultivate the qualities that fear itself cannot take away: courage, awareness, and compassion. Meeting fear as a teacher changes everything. It shifts our relationship with life. Challenges are no longer threats to avoid. They are opportunities to learn, to grow, to awaken. Fear is no longer a shadow that paralyzes us. It is a lantern illuminating the path. And as we walk that path, we realize something profound. The lessons fear offers are not external. They come from within. Fear reveals not just what is frightening in the world, but what is unacknowledged in ourselves. It invites us to wake up, to see clearly, and to live fully. The moment we begin to see fear as a teacher, we begin to see life differently. The ordinary anxieties, the subtle hesitations, the quiet worries, they all become teachers in disguise. And in listening, in learning, we discover that freedom does not lie in avoiding fear, but in understanding and embracing it. This realization naturally leads us to the next step, transforming fear into something even more powerful: compassion. Because as we understand our own fear, we begin to recognize it in others, and the heart opens in ways fear alone could never have imagined. When we truly begin to see fear as a teacher, another transformation begins to unfold, a shift from self-centered concern to something far larger: compassion. Fear is not merely a personal experience. It is a bridge that connects us to the struggles of others. By understanding our own fear, we awaken the ability to empathize deeply with the fears of those around us. Think of it. Each of us carries a private shadow, a quiet trembling that shapes our thoughts and actions. Now imagine seeing that same shadow mirrored in another person. A friend anxious about a new chapter in life, a loved one facing illness, a stranger paralyzed by loss. Suddenly, fear is no longer isolating, it becomes a point of connection. This is the power of mindfulness combined with understanding. When we meet fear within ourselves, we recognize its patterns, the tension, the racing thoughts, the clinging. And when we encounter these same patterns in others, judgment falls away. We no longer think, why are they so afraid? Instead, we feel, I understand. I know this trembling. I know this shadow. Buddhism teaches that all beings seek freedom from suffering just as we do. Fear is a form of suffering, a ripple in the pond of consciousness. And when we understand our own fear, we naturally extend that understanding outward. Compassion arises effortlessly because we know what it is to be human. Consider a parent whose child is struggling with rejection at school. The panic, worry, and fear mirror their own early experiences of inadequacy. Understanding their own fear allows them to approach the child with patience, presence, and care rather than judgment. Compassion flows naturally, grounded in insight and empathy. Or picture a community facing a natural disaster. Fear grips everyone, the unknown, the potential loss, the uncertainty. Yet shared understanding of that fear allows people to come together, support one another, and act with courage and love. Fear transforms from a paralyzing force into a unifying, motivating energy. Transforming fear into compassion also reshapes our relationship with life itself. When we see fear as a teacher, we no longer resist our own vulnerability. We no longer try to hide from the trembling inside. And as the shadow of our fear becomes familiar, the heart softens. Generosity, patience, and kindness are natural byproducts of this softening. It is important to remember, compassion does not mean indulgence. It does not mean ignoring challenges or pretending that fear does not exist. It means holding the truth of fear with clarity and love, seeing it, understanding it, and responding with care. Fear, when transformed, becomes a guide to awakening. It teaches us that vulnerability is not weakness, that uncertainty is not the enemy, and that the tender spaces in our hearts are the very places where connection and understanding flourish. In this way, fear is not merely a shadow, it is a doorway inviting us to expand beyond ourselves. Even the deepest, most primal fears, the fear of illness, the fear of loss, the fear of death, can be transformed into compassion. When we face these fears with awareness, we recognize them in the lives of others. We see that no one is exempt from suffering. And in this recognition, empathy deepens. Our own fear becomes a bridge, linking us to the shared human experience and urging us to act with kindness, care, and courage. Through mindfulness and understanding, fear evolves from a source of anxiety into a source of love. By embracing it rather than fleeing, by listening to its lessons rather than resisting them, we cultivate a heart that is strong and gentle at the same time, a heart capable of compassion for ourselves and for the entire world. And as this transformation takes root, we naturally approach life with a steadiness and freedom that fear alone could never allow. This opens the door to a fearless life, not the absence of fear, but the presence of awareness, insight, and compassion guiding every step we take. The next step in this journey is to see how this fearless way of living unfolds in the midst of life itself, in every decision, every encounter, every challenge. A life where fear no longer controls us, but simply informs us, guiding us toward freedom and courage. By the time we reach this point in the journey, something remarkable becomes clear. Living fearlessly does not mean never feeling fear. It does not mean a life free from uncertainty, loss, or challenges. True fearlessness is something far more profound. It is freedom from the tyranny of fear, the ability to feel it, acknowledge it, and move through life without being dominated by it. Fear will always arise. It is part of being alive. The racing heartbeat before a big decision, the nervousness before speaking your truth, the anxiety over loss or failure, these are not signs of weakness. They are signs of life, signs that we are engaged, that we care, that we are human. The difference lies in how we relate to it. When we cultivate awareness, understanding, and compassion, Fear becomes a teacher rather than a jailer. We learn to see its patterns, recognize its triggers, and meet it with mindfulness rather than panic. And in doing so, we discover something extraordinary. The space between fear and reaction. That space is freedom. That space is choice. Imagine a tightrope walker suspended above a deep canyon. Every instinct tells them to panic, to fall back, to cling desperately to safety. Yet through focus, balance, and trust, they move forward step by step. Fear is present, it sharpens the senses, it heightens attention, but it does not control the walk. Fear exists, but it no longer dictates the journey. This is the essence of living fearlessly. Fear is not eradicated, it is transformed. It informs our decisions, guides our awareness, and deepens our experience of life. It becomes a partner in the dance of living, rather than a shadow that pulls us backward. Consider the fears that shape your everyday life. The worry about relationships, health, work, or the unknown future. When you meet them with understanding and mindfulness, you realize that fear is simply a signal. It points to areas where courage, insight, and compassion can grow. And as you respond from this place of awareness, you begin to act with freedom, not constraint. Living fearlessly also means embracing uncertainty. Life is inherently unpredictable. No amount of planning, control, or preparation can shield us from change. But when we accept this truth, fear loses its power to paralyze. We learn to navigate life with curiosity rather than dread, with openness rather than clinging. This freedom transforms not only how we respond to our own fears, but how we interact with others. When we no longer project our anxieties onto the world, our relationships deepen. We communicate with honesty, listen with empathy, and act with integrity. Our fearlessness becomes contagious, inspiring courage and trust in those around us. And here is the subtle beauty of it. Living fearlessly does not require heroic acts or grand gestures. It manifests in the ordinary moments, in choosing to speak your truth, to love openly, to step into uncertainty with awareness. It is found in the calm breath taken when panic rises, the gentle pause before reacting, the soft recognition of fear as a teacher. Freedom from fear is the ultimate liberation. It is the space where clarity, compassion, and courage converge. It is the place where life is fully lived, not in avoidance, not in suppression, but in wholehearted engagement with the reality of each moment. As we carry this understanding forward, the final chapter of our journey draws near, a reflection on the totality of the path, the integration of mindfulness, understanding, and compassion, and the ultimate realization that fear, when seen clearly, is not a chain but a doorway. We have journeyed together through the shadows of fear, tracing its roots, understanding its patterns, and discovering the profound lessons it holds. Now, at the doorway of freedom, it's time to pause and reflect on what this journey has truly revealed. Fear is not an enemy. It is not a wall to be broken down or a monster to be slain. It is a teacher, a mirror, a companion that points us toward deeper awareness. It is a signal that illuminates where the mind clings, where the heart resists, and where insight waits patiently to be seen. From the trembling in the chest to the racing of thoughts, from the subtle anxiety of everyday life to the most primal fears of loss and death, fear has guided us. It has taught us patience, courage, mindfulness, and compassion. Every moment we faced it directly, every breath taken in presence, every quiet observation brought us closer to understanding. And in understanding, fear dissolves. This doorway to freedom is not a destination in the conventional sense. It is not a place we arrive at and remain forever. It is a living practice, an ongoing relationship with life as it is. To walk through it is to live with awareness, to move through the world with clarity, to respond rather than react, to meet uncertainty with curiosity rather than panic. Imagine life as a vast landscape, filled with peaks and valleys, storms and sunshine. Fear may appear as shadows along the path, but now we carry the lantern of understanding. We see fear clearly, we meet it mindfully, and we transform it into wisdom and compassion. The shadows no longer dominate us. They simply mark the terrain, guiding us toward fuller presence, deeper empathy, and greater freedom. Freedom from fear is not the absence of life's challenges. It is the presence of awareness, the steady heart, the open mind, the compassionate spirit. It is the ability to feel, to love, to act, to exist fully in each moment without being imprisoned by shadows that once seemed insurmountable. And here is the most beautiful truth: fear will arise again. It will always come because life is ever-changing, impermanent, unpredictable. But now fear is no longer a tyrant. It is a doorway. Each time it appears, we have the choice to run or to meet it with awareness, understanding, and compassion. Every encounter is an opportunity to walk through the doorway once more, to touch freedom and to deepen our wisdom. So, as we close this chapter, take a moment to breathe. Feel the life within you. Notice the subtle tremors, the quiet rhythms, the living presence of awareness. This is the doorway to freedom. It has always been here. Fear has never been separate from you. It has always been part of the path, pointing you toward clarity, courage, and the heart of life itself. The journey does not end here. It continues with each breath, each step, each encounter. But now you carry the lantern. You know that fear dissolves only with understanding, that mindfulness transforms shadows into teachers, and that compassion arises naturally when we see clearly. Walk through this doorway. Walk through fear with courage. Walk through life with awareness. And in doing so, you will discover that what once seemed a shadow is, in fact, a guide, leading you to the deepest freedom, the truest peace, and the profoundest joy. As we close this journey together, take a moment to feel the stillness within you. Let the lessons of fear, mindfulness, and compassion settle gently in your heart. If this resonated with you, if these words sparked a sense of clarity or calm, you are warmly invited to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Join our community of mindful seekers, where each video is a quiet step toward understanding, presence, and inner freedom. And if you feel called, leave a comment sharing your reflections, or share this video with someone who might need a little guidance through their own fears. Together, we can cultivate awareness, compassion, and peace, one mindful breath at a time.